Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history, from makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies. Their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and determination, so before you get comfortable, take a moment. Hear and let me know in the comments where you retuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do. Fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum and let us ease into tonight, this journey together when you think of medieval life. You might imagine jousting nights, grand feasts and merry fairs, but for the average peasant, winter was less about merit and more about how do we not die tonight. It wasn't just a season, it was a test of endurance that came around every year like an especially cruel teacher. Who didn't believe in second chances? Picture this: you're living in a tiny mud and stick hut with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside, no insulation. No windows, unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin, and definitely was usually just a polite couple of degrees. No thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home swallowed everything the wind. Above whatever the weather was doing outside, if it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing. Inside, congratulations nights where the worst darkness would turn you into some kind of human. Onion spoiler it, but mostly just roasting howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered, pathetically doing its best. The toes of whoever was sitting closest, if you were on the other side of the room, sorry. You might as well have been camping outside with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help. Either peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose. Down blankets, you had a couple of rough spun wool tunics. Maybe a cloak, a minor miracle, and honestly worth that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a hope that layering them didn't really work. And forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds were often nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure, and bonus some fleas for extra company luxury. My name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and with like a word, their homes were end. If you think your general freezing to death were constant risks, especially for young children, and they were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were. What historians elderly every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered. No celebrating, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock and praying. You didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows, and the real adventure was just beginning, if they existed at all. Were laughably tiny apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly. Medieval peasants just drafty nothing says. Rip the cowhide right off the wall mid. Blizzard to make matters worse. Floors, politely call wall and dorb construction translation. Sticks crisscross like a giant basket, smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator, plus it was always readily available. Shall we say these walls, matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind found every crack, every gap, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room homes, swirling around and making sure you never got two between them and the coming medieval popsicles, because if your house was falling apart, comfortable privacy, absolutely not warmth, not really character building. And goat hair, well, definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Pleasant evening, like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner windows, and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the Manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane, and peasants they some straw or old rushes to give were just happy. If the wind didn't, were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed, heavily mud seeped up through the ground. So technically you could say they had indoor water features, not that they appreciated it in winter. Every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh, cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat, but medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They packed gaps with moss, jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled. Close to each other, human insulation at its finest, creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only thing standing, and your best. Protection against the elements involved mud. At least you could laugh about it, sort of, if your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below. The frozen ground itself, floors weren't really floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth. Inside your home, maybe if you were lucky, someone had thrown down you the illusion of comfort, but make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulted back away from the cold, hard dirt, and oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up. Hoped you didn't lose a toe and forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry if it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature. Insulation, that grimy layer locked in body heated, and gloves was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, waking up were prized. Treasures, a simple woolen cap, could mean the difference between making it through the night or with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever could scourge, sometimes looking more like sad scraps of leather or fabric, people puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips. Waddling awkwardly around the house, the goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex, so the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe, at once looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrub it off. It was practically a survival tool, as it turns out. Getting grimy was a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say. But when genius see winter posed a very specific problem. Heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure. The air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret. Breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in, as peasants trudged through day after too often in winter. Could actually make you sick better to keep that protective holy day without washing their clothing layers of grime. Natural body oils and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself filth barrier intact bathing was rare. Laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions. Like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died, adding to the strategy. Peasants layered their clothes without changing months. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past. 6 weeks, every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud but didn't die. And if you had a thick, greasy outer to outside, observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they by February. You, my friend, were winning at life if you thought medieval had completely given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That grimy crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where, and regret, every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of literally everyone stank to high. Heaven you weren't offending anyone knows were usually a rough, creating a luxurious. Blindness was practically a way of life, so yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't zone-changing. The straw was a big a year. If you were diligent, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your failure, it was fashion. It was function layer peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts. Think again, the reality was a bit after that they became part of the muddy. More rustic, and by rustic, I mean let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best beds in the medieval peasant world wooden frame. If you could afford one covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw hay or old rushes, that is it, no memory foam. No orthopedic support, no five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard. Loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did if you woke up scratching crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor. Groundle sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary over time. The straw flattened, grew moldy, attracted bugs, and generally turned into a biological hazard. Event usually done a few times. Permission rushes were popular. Alternative, these long grasses were spread thick on the floor sometimes, mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming odor livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day. Trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows, fleas, lice, and other charming critters. More than you slept. Congratulations, you were living the authentic medieval experience. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat. Medieval central heating at its finest. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember somewhere out there a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, gritting through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, must be nice, when you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism. You quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance. They're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls, warped mud, crumbled thatch, sagged the cold with a seam to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist grudge. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass. Imagine standing there in, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole. Because in a way it was roof leaks were another battlefield, somewhere some particular determined souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, this is fine, this is luxury. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof. Especially after a few seasons of rain and snow, peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in fine the moments of true desperation, chunks of turf, stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through doors, windows. If you had them, you were lucky, but even then they were a little one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites and muddled their way through the worst winters, more than wood planks, hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness, window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts and add a bonus aroma of mystery. Meat to the living space every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless sneaky cold. One minute you were warm, the next minute a sudden gust with one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom, yet somehow. And restarting at Remember was about as so someone had to be on Ember Patrol, and since no one wanted to get up through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept, slightly frozen as a permanent state of being medieval peasants, patch stuffed in hay trying to catch a few precious hours of half frozen sleep the fire-needed constant nature could throw at them, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke prod and curse the fire back to life while trying not to hard enough to keep you awake at night. Medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud, sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand organized, with people moving about, animals rustling wind system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more. Desperate half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under, yet, despite the exhaustion, the system worked threadbare blankets to keep the hearth alive. The attention left alone, it would die down squinting into it. Didn't just battle the freezing air with cloaks easy as getting a stubborn donkey to dance once they were finally warmish. Families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, and frankly because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event, and when it was got elbowed awake, step on a goat, the rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons, just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were kept, their breathing shallow, slow, and pressed into service, learning early that in winter, everyone pulled their weight or froze, trying grandparents, sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both because of their experience, your turn to sleep, good luck battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too. Hard getting quality rest was a miracle. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of eyes in cold. Begrudging hands ready embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant smoking fire at 3 o'clock. I'm wondering if toes were really that important after all. You know, it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. Problem was simple. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs, in a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say Hail Mary. That was a risk nobody wanted to take, so peasants learned the art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they just run a marathon, they, most importantly, through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into the grave. By February, if you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, congratulations. You just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your soul with no doctors. And sight and grandma treating you with hot onion tea and firm prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months, and honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art in fewer forms, slow, steady nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible, like some grim Medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite. Inspirational quotes in the Grand Survival Playbook. It wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it. Against winter, in the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered, and turns out, one of the best ways worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the warrior body had to digest the long, relentless war, unlikely secret weapon, a full stomach to fight off. The cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak, it was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy. Right before bed, calories meant warmth more, it heated itself up doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and just maybe survive until morning, no. Artisanal garnishes without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before long? Freezing night, think thick stews heavy with root vegetables like turnips. Onions, a slow, and parsnips grains were lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley, GRL, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were especially lucky, say, after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This was in comfort. Food in the Instagram sense, no delicate presentation. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the turnips. Harsh but effective the night in keeping. You just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot. It was about eating smart foods that took longer to digest provided. Steady trickle of warmth, fatty foods were particularly praised, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burns. Slower than lean meat, a belly full of stew bread, and a questionable amount of lard peak medieval winter. Luxury parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips, you ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed parenting medieval style, of course. Heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams fueled by a stomach. Trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages, was it worth it? Absolutely, because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal, they were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full bloated and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just the heat from something another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated. It into the haybox, cover it up, and it stayed hot enough for a late night snack without needing 2 and 3 mattress pads. Medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime, and that's how the humble haybox and the ever-glamorous heated. Stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was. But the idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box linet, of course. There were risks if you didn't wrap the stone properly. Congratulations. You now had it thickly with hay and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge toss risk, reigniting the fire, medieval slow cookers basically, but peasants didn't. Just stop at food, they realized if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap even better rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone before heading to bed. But someone, probably whichever unlucky child, lost. The family argument would grab a flat stone and chuck it into the heart of the hearth fire after roasting it, until it was nearly too hot to touch a fine line between helpful. Burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay and the mattress or down at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Small localized house fire, and if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter. Injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice, but when everything went right, that stone provided precious comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose in the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into. Some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny miracle in a medieval peasant's home. The hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner, it was practically a family member, a temperamental smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure. Still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs. On prime real estate, parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers being assigned a spot close to. The fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge, and let's be honest, the best gossip protecting them with prime. Warmth was non-negotiable, but it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering suspiciously too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance stay near enough to bask in the fire. A glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked for a roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth. Evenly, it mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat, like cold lizards jostling sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course. Muscled into, a dog might wedge itself frozen between you and the fire tail, wagging dangerously close to open flame chickens. Sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny, feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers was a tiny promise. You're still alive, you're still warm for now, and so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses each breath, forming a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life. Clinging to warmth by a thread of a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much if glowing coals in the medieval world. No one survived winter alone unless they wanted. As house went dark, you noticed if the smoke from old Tom S. hearth suddenly stopped curling into the... Someone went to check, and not just because Tom owed you a chicken though, to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair, it was a village project. Everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, your neighbor's sky, that might be part of it, but because community meant survival, villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly who couldn't work the fields, but could keep an eye on who was coughing too. Hearts sometimes pulled their last salted meat. Meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vest, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor would, whose good cooking pot never really went rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or better yet invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, but it was better than finding frozen friends. Come spring thaw, communal food stores played a role too during especially brutal winters. Villages, grain, and dried vegetables. It was grim charity. No one had much, but a few communal wanted. Every possible advantage, including a little divinal grudges, were often quietly. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking, sure. Medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened, disputes over land goats or who borrowed could land you away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, Asked to protect households from sudden ruin during the lean, deadly months, superstitions wrapped themselves. Shelved after all arrival was still worth saving because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue in the icy heart of winter. The village became one big stubborn family, sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive. Together, one muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile, at a time when medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter. They didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed a lot because when the wind howled like wolves outside, your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers. Intervention faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then, it was woven into every frozen breath. Before crawling under layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes attached by mourning saints. Became more than distant holy figures, they were winter's frontline defense. Some, for instance, was called upon to protect against throat ailments. Not a minor concern when one mouthful of icy air coughing up your soul. St. Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He was also snugly around daily survival. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would protect against evil spirits, or at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a role too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the night, a flickering plea against the cold. Darkness clawing at the walls, and of course no serious winter. Prayer session was complete without a few promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival, a little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough, and when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It took entire families, whole villages vanishing, them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the infamous Great Famine winter of 1315, when rains destroyed crops. Livestock starved, and in the most horrifying cases, each freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather bark. Other failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience. It was often a death sentence without the hearth's meager warmth. Families huddled together for the final time. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across whole households in spring bodies, still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if trying to share just a little more heat, until the very themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms, a roof giving way in houses, frostbite fingers, toes, even ears blackened. And in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic, it was often fatal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors wasn't a guarantee either, especially if those neighbors were already stretched to the breaking point. Disease loved the cold too. Starvation weakened the body and cramped smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet horror. Died while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived winters, a fight worth fighting when we look back at medieval peasants, those at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honor that said, I made it through, but winter took a piece of me. Yet what's most haunting isn't just the death, it's the eerie normalcy of it. People accepted that each winter some among them wouldn't see the Thor death, wasn't unexpected. It was just another neighbor at the door wrapped in frost, waiting its turn even amid the bitter cold, and they didn't even have the luxury of assuming they do survive until spring, but what they did have in constant threat, medieval peasants pressed on stubborn grieving, clinging to life, because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was every still muddy. Frostbitten survivors of endless winters, it's tempting to see only their hardships. The cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts, but buried beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful, a legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable fear, but out. By each brutal winter, their communities were built on endurance. They didn't have central heating, thermal jackets, or cozy. Memory and life find a way to push through the frozen ground, and somehow it did. Because foam mattresses surviving one more, what they left behind was the blueprint for resilience. Every hasted mattress, hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity. Under pressure, faced with impossible odds, they didn't collapse in, and ingenuity are refusing to give in. To the despair they adapted, they learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter lessons. Carved one stubborn heartbeat at a more than shared land, they were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pull resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance. They wove prayers into their daily lives, not just out of hope, fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again, wood of their sacrifices because of their unglamorous victories. Night one more storm, future generations thrived bit by frozen bit. They pushed humanity forward, enduring winters. Their ancestors could barely survive until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant dreams, their blood sweat stitched invisibly into the lives we live now, every cozy blanket, every warm house. Every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea under soft lights, all of it is the end result of countless medieval peasants cold, so the next time the wind howls outside your double-pannied window, maybe spare a thought for them, the nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy, one ember, one breath. Time Anne Boleyn didn't come into the world with a crown on her head or armies at her feet born. Around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hir Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noble woman with powerful family ties in the grand scheme of Tudor society. Anne's birth barely stirred a ripple yet from these modest beginnings. Something extraordinary was taking root, a life from an early age, and that would one day tilt the course of English history. Was set apart not by her wealth, but by her mind. She was clever-spirited, and by where an experience few English girls could dream of there. Anne absorbed the art of all accounts magnetic. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her abroad to the continent. Her education truly began first. She served Margaret of Austria in the glittering court of the Netherlands. Diplomacy, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics, but it was in France that, in the art of Anne's brilliance, was truly polish. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, learning the language of influence, elegance, flirtation, wit, while other young women perfected their embroidery. Anne mastered conversation, intrigue, commanding attention without ever seeming to seek it. By the time she returned to England in beauty, even her admirers admitted as the early 1520s. Anne was something rare, a woman who could rival the sophistication of continental courtiers while carrying the ambition of a rising English house. She wasn't a classic much, but she was arresting dark eyes that sparked with intelligence, a quick musical voice, a way of moving that suggested purpose, just barely concealed beneath layers of courtly grace. And didn't just enter rooms. She changed their gravity at a time when Anne Boleyn returned to the English court. She was unlike anyone. The fate was often sealed by birth and marriage. Anne refused to drift quietly into obscurity. She had seen the power. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas to ignore her, and she intended to use that knowledge at apart from the gentle, obedient ladies who filled the court of king that charm and intellect could wield in foreign courts home Anne. Berlin was still a young woman, then clever, ambitious, untested, but history was already beginning to stir around her. Berlin's daughter, she was a player in a larger game, one that would soon engulf the crown itself nobility had ever seen in a world full of pale-faced modest. English Rose's Anne was a thunderstorm, electric, unpredictable, impossible dark. Hair-bold eyes and quick, sharp wit set her Henry VIII. At first she played the role expected of her, a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, but even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too bright to snuff out. She danced gracefully, spoke French with the ease of a native, and laughed with a confidence, frustration, longing. Henry offered her the role of few women. Dared display, men noticed women, gossiped the court, buzzed quietly about mistress lost to time of Henry. The striking Berlin girl, it wasn't long before she caught the most dangerous attention of all the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was a playground of whispered promises and secret liaison, but Anne was different. She didn't swoon the English court, and Berlin made her choice not to be merely where queens wielded soft power from behind lace fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was at his compliments, or fall eagerly into his arms like so many others had she teased, she challenged, she refused. Henry, a man used to instant adoration, was captivated the more. Anne held him at arm's length. The deeper he fell, letters passed between them filled. Had known for centuries the king's desire to marry Anne hit a small snag. Namely, he was with declarations of love. Royal mistress, the most powerful unofficial position at court, Anne astonishingly said no, she would not be just another conquest, a forgotten wanted. Her he would have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so audacious that it stunned the court. After all, the king was already married his queen. Catherine, for there, was beloved by the people and fiercely protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. The church itself would have to be defied for Henry to claim Anne, but Anne didn't flinch. She had lived in the courts of Europe, dangerous game, but it was a game she intended to win, standing in the candle, eagerly lit halls of admired that to change her destiny and England's forever, what began as an intense flirtation between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn soon spiraled into a national crisis. Henry wasn't merely besotted. He was obsessed, and in his obsession he was willing to tear apart everything. England, already married to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Catherine, dignified and resilient, refused to quietly step aside. She had been Henry's faithful wife for 2 decades, and in the eyes of God and the English people, she was the rightful queen. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was almost unthinkable, but Henry was determined. He convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had once been married to his brother Arthur, never mind that the Pope had granted special permission union years ago. Henry now insisted that his soul was damned unless he annulled the marriage. Anne, for her part, knew better than to appear too eager. She kept herself just out of reach, alternately encouraging Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Every glance, every word was measured. She wasn't merely aiming for marriage. She was positioning herself to become Queen of England. The court erupted into whispers and factions. Some noble families courted Anne's favor, seeing the winds of power shifting. Others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine, horrified at the idea of Anne replacing her diplomats, wrote desperate letters back to Rome. Foreign monarchs threatened retaliation. Henry's own advisors shifted uneasily, sensing the ground trembling beneath their feet as months turned into years. Henry's frustration grew. He bombarded the Pope with petitions, maneuvered his lawyers into finding loopholes, and slowly began to realize that the church would not bend easily. Catherine had powerful allies, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe still. Henry pressed on defying advice tradition and increasingly the law itself. His courtship with Anne had become something far greater than personal desire. It was now a challenge to the very had begun, and there could be no turning structure of England's political and religious life. Anne wasn't just capturing a king's heart, she was dragging an entire kingdom into uncharted waters. A dangerous game back after nearly 7 agonizing years of maneuvering scandal and diplomatic chaos. Anne Boleyn's gamble paid off in January 1533. She secretly married Henry VIII, a bold move given that he was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon in the eyes of the Pope and much of Europe. By June, Anne was crowned queen, but if this new queen with her French manners and daring spirit was a blessing or a curse, Anne entered her of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the crowning moment of her life. Atmosphere was far from universally joyful. The people of London watched with weary eyes, some cheered others, muttered prayers for Queen Catherine. Many wondered precarious everything rested on one thing providing. Henry was the hope of a dynasty early in her pregnancy. Anne and Henry. Queenship not as a beloved figure, but as a storm. Unlike Catherine, who embodied traditional English values of humility and piety, Anne was dazzling, provocative, and politically savvy. She wore bold colors, commanded the court with sharp, was less composed intelligence, and made powerful enemies with breathtaking speed. Her position, while seemingly secure, was also terrifyingly. The once obedient Henry began moving. A male heir, Anne knew this as keenly as anyone. She was not merely Henry's lover anymore. She were elated, certain the child would be a boy, but in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To Anne's credit, she masked all so that Anne, as her crushing disappointment with Grace, insisting the next child would surely be his son Henry. However, his eyes, once full of adoration, now flickered with doubt. Still, for a time, Anne's star burned, was already beginning to look beyond the brilliant woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had brightly, she reshaped the English court in her image, elevating her family to unprecedented heights and becoming the first queen in English history crowned with the sacred oil usually reserved for a male heir. Her first child kings. Her influence was vast. Foreign ambassadors sought her favor. Couriers had the cracks in her reshuffled alliances to be in her good graces, and suffered multiple England officially away from Rome, creating the Church of England with himself at its head, many nobles, and never one to suffer in silence. Crown could not be questioned yet. Even in her triumph, dark clouds gathered. Friends whispered behind their hands, rivals circled waiting, and Henry, fickle great, blaming her for the schism with Rome, and in restless won the throne, but keeping it would demand more than charm, ambition, or even one where Anne had dazzled him with love. Anne Boleyn had climbed higher than almost any woman of her time, but the higher you rise, the harder the fall. Almost from the moment she placed the crown on her world began to show at the heart of Anne. As struggles was the pressure to produce, had already begun imagining life without the woman. Elizabeth, though bright and healthy, was not the son Henry V had hung his dynastic hopes upon, and the clock was ticking. Pregnancies in quick succession, but heartbreak followed. Miscarriages that Cromwell, once her ally, sensed the changing tide. They began laying the groundwork, left her physically weakened and emotionally battered. Each lost child chipped away at the foundation she had built. Henry, once passionately devoted, began to pull away. His disappointment carving rifts between them. Argued, demanded, fought to keep her place. But Henry, a man who prized obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her sharpness, her defiance. The very fire that had once drawn him in outside the royal chambers. Enemies were gathering like wolves who had tolerated Anne's rise with gritted teeth, now openly schemed for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave Anne for what they saw as theft and sacrilege. Even commoners whispered against her, calling her the heavy-handed changes that followed. And then came Jane Seymour, quiet, demure. Everything Anne was not Jane captured Henry's wandering attention, just as Anne's influence began to Brilliance and challenge, Jane offered soothing compliance. It was a dangerous shift, and Anne, perceptive as ever saw it happening, she tried to reclaim her position. Lavishing attention on Henry, promising more sons, begging for patience, but the king ever fickle for whom he had once torn. A kingdom apart, Anne's political enemies, including Thomas. For a campaign of destruction, quietly gathering accusations, rumors, and witnesses. The woman who had played the dangerous game of ambition so masterfully was now losing ground and had won. Her crown through cunning and courage, but in the brutal shifting world of Henry's court, past victories meant little, only fresh success mattered, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives. The queen who had shattered a kingdom would soon see how quickly, with armies or swords, they came with whispers. Secret's kingdom could shatter her Anne. Berlin's enemies didn't attack her. The back rooms of court betrayal was brewing, and carefully sharpened lies in silence. Patient deadly Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's greatest ally in the English. Reformation had turned against her. Their alliance had been built on mutual ambition, but now their interests clashed. Anne wanted reforms to help the poor and limit the power of greedy. Nobles, Cromwell wanted stability, favor with Henry, and no interference. Anne's boldness had made her dangerous, and in Henry's fickle heart love had curdled into irritation, suspicion, and cold detachment. Anne had few true friends, left even her charm, once her greatest weapon, now grated against the court's hunger for a gentler, more pliable queen, and Jane Seymour. Quiet and calculating, waited just out of sight, the perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire it was. Cromwell, who moved first, knowing Henry was restless, knowing that the king wanted an exit, but lacked a convenient conspiracy against the king and the proud. Brilliant queen excuse. Cromwell offered a solution. What if Anne could be removed, not by divorce, which would humiliate Henry, but by disgrace? The accusations were wild, monstrous, even adultery, incest. Painted as a betrayer, a temptress, a threat to the very crown, she once redefined Cromwell, carefully gathered evidence, coaxing confessions under torture, twisting courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including Anne's own brother, George Berlin, were arrested. The charges made little sense. They were riddled with contradictions and impossibilities, but in Henry's court and taken to the... As the great gate slammed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no truth, was whatever the king needed it to be, and sensing the tightening noose fate, and now alone and stood in the great hall, she was a prisoner, a pawn trapped in the brutal game. She had once fought desperately. She appealed Henry's memory to the love they had once shared, but it was no use. The man who had once torn England apart for her, now who had once changed the destiny of England. The charges against her were shocking, refused to meet her eyes in May 1536. Anne was arrested, but here now they were simply theater, a grim performance. Tower of London, longer a queen played. So masterfully betrayal had sealed her tower. Anne Boleyn waited for the final move. Anne Boleyn of the Tower of London, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their very by titles and fortunes to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, prepared to erase the woman adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Berlin, high treason conspiracy against the king in another world. Such accusations against a queen would have been unthinkable. She reminded them of her loyalty. Her Anne set foot in the courtroom. The trial was a spectacle for the court and for the people, a public, but her spirit fiercely designed to give Henry VII exactly what he wanted. Anne's downfall wrapped in a thin veil of legality. Anne defended herself with the same fire that had once won Henry's heart. She denied every accusation with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering but brilliant composure that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen God, and anointed as Queen of England. Sacrifices her love, but it was all for nothing. The verdict had been decided. Anne Boleyn was returned long before. And making of a once unbreakable woman, witness after witness, many coerced, or Anne prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, Bribed spoke, damning words, dates, and places contradicted. Each other evidence was flimsy when it existed at all, but the truth was irrelevant now. Anne was found guilty, her brother. George and the other men accused with her were sentenced to death as well. Anne would be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering when the verdict was read. And did not break. She stood tall, her face pale, intact in those final moments. Before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, declaring that she was prepared to die and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul as the heavy doors of the hall. Close behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm Anne had dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over, but even then they did not understand. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn, they were immortalizing her in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner. Awaiting death, yet even facing the end, Anne refused to crumble in the cold, echoing halls of the tower, kneeling on the hard stone floors. Her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom and perhaps mercy to her little daughter Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, those few who had stayed loyal, wept in private. Anne comforted them. Instead of the other way around, she joked bitterly at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head, and her dark humor was the stubborn spark that had made her Henry. Meanwhile, showed no sign of mercy. He had already, unforgettable, turned his attention to Jane Seymour even before Anne's execution date was finalized. Henry was arranging his next marriage for Anne, this final betrayal from the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her must have been the deepest cut. On May 18th, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself for the ambition and pride that had led her here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution. Faster, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. It was a small mercy, bought perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's. Anne dressed carefully for her final moment, a dark gray gown of comfort at dawn, damask trimmed with fur, a crimson kirt beneath colors of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace as the tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones. Anne Boleyn, Queen Mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage in the face of history's judgment. Her end, a few witnesses, all wrapped in silence, was near, but her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built within the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anne stood tall, her gray gown fluttering slightly in the cold morning breeze. She looked thinner than she had at court, her face pale but calm. There were no hysterics, no broken sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its knees. She spoke briefly, carefully, eyes lifted toward the choosing her final words. She did not accuse, she did not defend herself. She, and Anne Boleyn, Queen Mother, history maker, was now prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her in those final moments. Anne offered the world not a confession but forgiveness, her courage stunned, even because those who had come to see her fall the French executioner brought, specially to ensure a swift death, stepped forward. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer. Her power and global influence, a queen who inherited her heavens. A small white cloth was tied around her eyes. She remained still, the Elizabeth, I, the virgin queen whose reign sword flashed once silent, swift more. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, laid to rest in an arrow chest. No proper coffin had been prepared for her, a queen, once crowned in gold, now Left to vanish without ceremony, yet Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave. Her daughter Elizabeth Country had soured into the child, whose birth had once disappointed. A king would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English. She had worn him life in the end. Anne Boleyn once showed the world that even queens could be cast aside, yet through her blood, through Elizabeth Anne's legacy. The anger showed itself. History would see the flowering of English art mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn changed the war and frustration course of England, forever her ambition. Helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall blazed brighter than any crown. A kind of immortality, not through her survival, but through her indelible impact on. But every small victory was followed by new history. By the early 1770s, the American colonies simmered like a pot left too long over a roaring fire. The relationship with Britain, once seen as the proud mother, resentment, suspicion, and growing fury, it hadn't started with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had enraged colonists by placing taxes on everything from newspapers to playing cards. That was followed by the Townshend Acts taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law passed thousands of miles away by a parliament in which the colonists had no representation was like another spark. Landing in dry brush at first. In polite petitions and fiery pamphlets, colonial assemblies drafted formal protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with passionate arguments about liberty and rights. But as time deepened into something darker, a slow realization that Britain wasn't listening worse, Britain didn't care many. Colonists clung to the hope that if they just made enough noise, if they just reasoned hard enough, Parliament would repeal the taxes, and sometimes they did. The Stamp Act was famously repealed after loud colonial protest legislation. New taxes, new insults. It wasn't about the money. It never really was. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What infuriated the colonists was the principle they were being taxed without consent, treated as subjects rather than. Officials could seize the cargo, and British troops could be called in to enforce the law. Everyone knew it, everyone knew. What was at stake if the tea came ashore? The principle was lost to rights and liberty. Would unravel that morning if the colonists allowed it, even once there caused their claim. Thousands of Bostonians and nearby colonists packed into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some had walked miles through the icy countryside to be there. The meeting was so packed, the iron voice of rebellion, that men spilled out into the streets, straining to hear the fiery. But even among the defiance, uncertainty hung as the afternoon wore on. Riders galloped, speeches echoing through the halls. Samuel Adams presided over the gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out against Samuel tyranny, to urge immediate action. Heavy. What could be done without sparking outright war? How could they stop the tea without opening the floodgates to brutal retaliation? And with grim news, Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unmoved. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading the tea, would be seized, the tax collected. The king's law enforced. The crowd buzzed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to shudder with the force of it. Yet 16th Adams stood calmly and spoke the words that signaled the end of debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. A simple sentence, but everyone knew. What it meant had passed. Boston would answer not with words, but of taking a stand as something new, something fierce. By the dozens they made, there would be no more petitions, no more compromises. Action would be. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver lay anchored. There was no shouting, no. Taken outside, a war whoop cut through the gathering gloom. The signalmen, no harm came to the sailors, disguised themselves, quickly smearing soot on their faces, donning blankets and feathers in crude imitation of mohawk, and clubs that disguised. Colonists swarmed and watched in silence as the operation began. Men split of tea leaves. Warriors, it wasn't about fooling anyone. It was about creating a symbol, a message no one could mistake. The deadline of the harbor chest. After chess 342 and with defiance as twilight deepened over Boston on December, only the tea, the hated symbol. 1773, the quiet streets began to stir figures. Moved through the shadows, there was an understanding something had shifted, and ordinary men cloaked in rough blankets, their faces blackened with soot, some adorned with feathers. They weren't trying to fool anyone into believing they were. Real Mohawks, their disguise was symbolic, an act of shedding their old identities, their way to Griffin. Arf, where the 3 tea ships' harbor water churned cold and dark beneath, them thick with the sharp bite of winter air there. Drunken chaos, this was not a riot, it was a mission carried out with calm, ruthless precision, armed with hatchets, deliberate defiance. Carried out under the cloak of night, the harbor was transformed into a giant swirling ships, overwhelming the few crew members. Still aboard at Black, some colonists, curious and rebellious, scooped handfuls. And back streets of Boston, they left behind no names, no leaders, no claims to fame, and soaking tea leaves, the smell of the sea mixed with the sharp tang of smashed tea. Filling the night air with they were pushed aside, opened the wooden chests with practiced blows. The fragrant smell of fresh tea spilling into the cold night air others. Heaved the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the still waters. Total was broken and dumped until the black water swirled with thousands of pounds and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderate spectators watched from the wharf, silent aid British guards stationed. Nearby made no move to intervene, whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating violence remains it sent. Unclear, some accounts suggest that even among British loyalists there would be no stopping it tonight. The discipline was extraordinary. No cargo was stolen, no one raided the ships for valuables of British oppression, was targeted in a town where hunger and hardship were daily realities. The men could have easily turned the protest into an excuse for looting. They did not. When it was over, the harbor resembled a great swirling cauldron filled with torn chests, strange bittersweet scent. The work was done silently. The men disappeared into the night, vanishing into the alleys, only the unmistakable mark of revolution as the last broken crates bobbed in the dark water. Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot, a brawl, or a drunken spectacle. It was something far rarer, an act of cold teapot, thousands of pounds of yeast. India Company tea floated in great mats on the water, staining of soaked leaves from the harbor, only to be chastised by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one would profit from this night's work. This was principle pure and simple. The town woke the next morning to the smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. News spread like wildfire, word of mouth letters. Broadsheets by midday, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had happened, and opinions split fast among patriots. There was pride, a fierce, swelling pride that ordinary men had stood up to the mightiest empire in the world. There was horror to them. The destruction of property was reckless, dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line they couldn't walk back from, Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, furious not only at the destruction but at the message. Citizens ruled like distant possessions rather than partners. Boston, more than any other city, became the beating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, fiery group of patriots, grew louder and bolder, and 1770 tensions exploded into violence. Trust was a thing of the past. By 1773, the colonies were teetering. When British soldiers fired on unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre, blood had already stained the Saison cobblestones, but in the quiet, seemingly harmless shape of crates stacked with on the edge. A final insult would tip them into open defiance, and it came not in the form of soldiers or new laws or armies. Would change forever. In 1773, Parliament made it critical. Tea, the colonists didn't know it yet, but the night that tea floated in the cold waters of Boston Harbor. The world miscalculation, believing the American colonies would quietly accept cheaper tea. They passed the Tea Act, a law that was supposed to save the struggling British East India Company and incidentally reassert Britain's right to Tax the colonies on paper, it looked like a good deal. The Tea Act allowed the a few pennies cheaper, what could possibly go wrong company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, slashing prices and offering a luxury. Its right to tax behind it, the Tea Act left the hated tax, the news of the Tea Act. Spread like product at a bargain became a matter of honor, a litmus test for swelled newspaper columns burned with fiery Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel. Adams and others organized everything because the problem wasn't the price of tea. It was the principle that no. East India Company. Tea would be unloaded, sold, or on tea firmly in place. Accepting the tea even at a discount would mean acknowledging Parliament from New York to Charleston. The message was clear, we will. The colonies, without their consent, to many Americans, that was unthinkable, a surrender of the liberties they had fought to protect for more than a decade. The Dartmouth, the Illilouina, and the Beaver arrived anchored, and the Bostonians recognized the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as, but in Boston. Fate twisted differently. Wildfire through the colonies, merchants fumed. They saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that would crush local trade. Patriots raged at the hidden message. The Crown still believed it could do whatever it pleased in Boston. The reaction was especially fierce already. A city scarred by the Boston Massacre and years of economic hardship, a bargain refusing the tea. Loyalty to the cause of liberty, public meetings, rhetoric groups like the of the resistance thousands, crammed into the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air, calling on citizens to boycott British tea, and held raucous meetings that swelled with farmers, artisans, and boycotts vowing drunk on American soil. All across the colonies, ships carrying the controversial tea were turned away by local resistance in ports not be bought by force. The Sons of Liberty understood 3 ships harbor and sat there refusing to leave. Royal officials insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused a deadlock. Grew taut as a drawn boring, the tension was unbearable. A single act would break it, and history would never. But while the people of Boston stood united, the clock was ticking. Be the same again as the British tea ships sat stubbornly anchored in Boston Harbor. The city itself transformed into a powder keg. Every day that passed without coming, you could feel it in the air that it would take one spark to ignite an explosion, and somewhere, among the crowded streets and crowded hearts of resolution, tightened the tension. Boston wasn't just resisting, it was preparing for a fight in taverns, churches, and public squares. Angry colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved swiftly to organize resistance. They posted public notices for nearly 3 weeks. The tea ships had sat in as a rival if it wasn't customs merchants. Alike, each gathering added fuel to the fire, the Old South meeting. House became the nerve center, their voices rising in defiance. Here resolutions were passed, speeches were made, and tempers boiled. Each vote against the unloading of tea was another hammer blow against British authority. British law demanded that imported goods like tea be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days if the ships remained after the deadline. Customs officials would seize the cargo and the tax would be collected. That once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principal would be lost. It wasn't just about the tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated as subjects without rights, or whether they would stand and fight for their future. Meanwhile, the royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in his heels. He refused to let the tea ships leave without unloading their cargo, demanding that the law be obeyed. Colonial outrage be damned to him. Backing down meant admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a spectacle. Every man, woman, and child knew that something was cold, sharp sense before a storm. When the world holds its breath, all was Boston. A decision was quietly taking shape, a plan that would echo across oceans and empires. December 16th, 1773. Dawned gray and cold over Boston, a city balanced on the edge of history. The harbor, like ticking bombs. Now the final deadline had arrived according to British law. The tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of ship.